Before 6 of a drought morning in the summer of 1818, the driest summer the downland could remember, a woman stood on the roof of the Shalbourne almshouses, stripping out a rotten patch of thatch, and a clerk stood at the foot of her ladder reading her ruin off a fair-copied sheet. By direction of Mr. Bulstrode, agent to His Grace the Duke of Stowholt, the clerk read, pitching his voice up the roof slope, "Notice is given that the thatching work of the estate passes at Michaelmas Quarter-day to an established firm of the county town. The cottage in Church Row, being tied to the work, is to be given up at that date." Dulcie Maidment did not stop working. Her legate, the flat wooden bat a thatcher drives the straw coat tight with, kept its slow rhythm on the eave above his head. Knock, knock, knock. The sound had woken Shalbourne gently on more mornings than the church clock had. "The notice is addressed," the clerk went on, and here he faltered, because even a clerk has a conscience at 6 in the morning, "to Maidment, Thatcher, of Church Row. Knock, knock." Maidment, Thatcher, had been dead 8 years. Everybody in the parish knew it. The clerk knew it. The vestry book knew it best of all. For 8 years that book had entered the parish, thatching to a dead man's name, and paid a boy's wage against it. The alternative was to write down that the master who kept every roof in Shalbourne dry was the dead man's daughter. Twice the vestry had come near to writing it. Twice a churchwarden cleared his throat, and the clerk went on to the next entry. The woman on the roof let it stand. Her father had taught her the first law of the trade before anything else. Keep the parish dry, whoever gets the wage. The clerk folded his paper. He looked up once at the figure against the sky. She was a woman of 27, tall and straight-backed in a working gown of deep Delft blue, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair bound up in a bright kerchief. The ease of her balance unsettled him, and he did not linger. Going out of the yard, he said a thing to himself, low. It was the thing the county had said for 12 years, and the dry air carried it up the roof slope, every word. "The burner's girl." The legate missed one beat, then it went on. Below her the village lay baked pale. The wells were low, the ponds cracked to plates of clay, and every thatched roof in Church Row was as dry as tinder. At the field edge beyond the churchyard stood the blackened footings of the estate's great barn. It had burned 12 years before and was never rebuilt, a black square in the stubble like a pulled tooth. At the end of the estate yard, new that spring, Mr. Bulstrode's lime kiln put up its thin ribbon of smoke. The agent had building works in hand, and lime must be burned where it is cheapest to burn, whatever stands 30 yards downwind. She worked the patch out and the new straw in before the heat of the day. Then she ate her bread at the top of the ladder, looking down Church Row. 14 cottages, the church house and the almshouses lay below her. Every roof of them was hers, coat and ridge, laid and mended and known by hand in the dark. The cottage at the Rose end with the faded board over the door was hers too, until Michaelmas. Maidment and son, the board said. Her grandfather had cut it, her father had been the son, and she was what the parish got. Michaelmas Quarter-day, and the summer to get through first. Eating her bread in the dry morning wind, she had no notion of what the summer was carrying towards her. That evening, with the light going amber, Dulcie walked the chalk lane out to Budden's. She went every year about hay-time to look over his cart hovel roof. Budden was a carter, 60-odd, broad and flaxen-headed going white, with big scarred, careful hands. His cottage was poor, and his hovel poorer, a low ruinous shed with no business under good thatch. Yet it had good thatch. The best straw she could draw, laid tight, ridged sound, recoated every 3rd year. Her father had kept that roof before her, and she had asked him about it once, when she was a girl. Why did a master thatcher give his best work to a hovel that sheltered nothing anyone had ever seen? Because Budden asks, her father had said, and won't say why. He was paid in eggs, and in a silence she had never pried at. Budden stood in his garden and watched her walk the eave and test the coat with her palm. She said the ridge would want attention before winter, and he nodded and looked at his boots. "You'll do it yourself," he said, and it was not said as asking. "Who else?" "I," said Budden, and looked away down the lane towards the black footings in the stubble, and said nothing else. He had a padlocked door on that hovel, a heavy estate lock. In all the years she had worked above it, she had never once seen it stand open. She noticed, walking home, that she did not wonder about it any more. 12 years ago she had asked twice. She had let it alone since, and so had Shalbourne. Her father's long tool basket hung where it always hung, inside her own door in Church Row. It was the straw basket a thatcher carries his iron in. At the bottom of it, under the shears and the spar hooks, lay one thing of her father's. She had never found a use for it, and never thrown it away. A heavy estate padlock, open, its shackle swung wide, the crown struck with the Stowholt Wheat-Sheaf, and no key to it in the house. The lock that fits nothing, her father had called it, the one time she asked. He said it once, flat, with his eyes elsewhere, and never said anything about it again. She had left it where it lay, 12 years, at the bottom of the basket, under the iron. 2 days after the notice, Mr. Stanley Bulstrode attended the Shalbourne vestry in person. He did not often trouble to do it, and he laid his reasons on the table in a fan. He was a tall man of 48, silver fair, dressed in blue-black superfine with a heavy watch chain across his front. He had been agent to the Stowholt estate 15 years. He had the bearing men learn in public rooms, and the voice to go with it. "Gentlemen, nobody quarrels with the work," he said, and touched the papers before him one by one. "The parish has been fortunate in its arrangements, but an estate is not run on fortune. Here are the testimonials of the county firm, an established partnership of the county town, indentured masters, their written warranty, their named sureties. Their promise is written and backed by men who can be made to answer for it. That is the power to compel. What the parish has at present is a custom, and a custom compels nothing. His Grace's late father understood this. I have every confidence His Grace will understand it too." The churchwardens looked at the table and not at each other. One of them, an honest farmer, opened his mouth. Mr. Bulstrode turned on him a face of such patient, courteous attention that the mouth closed again. The fan of testimonials lay on the vestry table like a winning hand. Every man in the room was holding the same question, and nobody asked it. Who had kept the church tower dry through the wet spring of 16, and what name had the book put it under? The Duke of Stowholt came to Shalbourne on a Tuesday, riding the parched edge of his inheritance with his agent's reports in his saddlebag. The reports said the almshouses were sound. Harvey, Duke of Stowholt, was 34 and 2 years in his title. His invalid father had governed it before him from a sick room, by letter, through his agent, for 12 years. He was tall, heavy in the shoulder, dark blonde going gold in the drought sun, beautifully dressed, and raised on one lesson above all others. A gentleman does not judge work. A gentleman buys judgment in the form of testimonials and warranties from men whose business it is to have it. He had a warranted county firm for his roofs and a smooth agent for his land. He also had a private suspicion, folded very small underneath his education. He had never once in his life seen the difference between work and the paper that vouched for work. He found the thatcher on the almshouse roof, sat his horse at the foot of her ladder, and read to her out of the quarter-day letter, patched in the spring by the county firm, warranted sound. Dulcie came down the ladder. She looked at the letter and then at him, and did not argue with either. "Will your Grace come up into the loft," she said, "and let the roof answer for itself?" The loft over the almshouse east range was low, hot and dark, and smelled of dust and old straw. She went up the inner ladder ahead of him and stood him in the middle of the boards and let his eyes settle. "Now," she said, "look up and tell me what you see." He looked up into blackness, and the blackness came alive with stars. Dozens of them. Pinholes and pencil points of white fire all down the slope the county firm had warranted, wherever their patchwork met the old coat. "Light," he said slowly. "I see daylight." "Daylight in a loft," said Dulcie Maidment, "where daylight has no business. Every point of light your grace can see is a hole. Where sun comes in, rain comes in. Rain rots the fixings, rot drops the coat, and 3 old women sleep under this slope. That is what daylight in a roof means, and no paper unsees it." He was quiet a long moment in the hot dark, under the warranted stars. "And the letter in my hand says this roof is sound," he said. "The letter is sound," she said. "The roof is not." She did not wait to enjoy it. She went down and up the outside ladder with her long tool basket on her shoulder, and set about mending the worst of the patch from above. 3 old women slept under it, and the year had one storm in it somewhere, drought or no. The Duke of Stowholt stood at the ladder foot in his beautiful coat with nothing to do, and found that he could not simply stand there. Nobody had asked him for anything. That was somehow the unbearable part. "What is it you want passed up?" he said, pitching it up the slope. "Yelms," she said. "A yelm is a drawn armful of straw, combed straight and squared at the butts, ready to lay. There's a row made up by the wall." He took off his coat, hung it on a rung, and carried straw. For above an hour, the Duke of Stowholt served yelms up a ladder to a thatcher's daughter, asked her workman's questions, and got workman's answers. "What holds the coat on?" "Spars," she told him, "split hazel rods, twisted and driven like great staples. What the hooked iron rods were. Sways, the holding rods that pin each course while it is fixed." Why the drought frightened her more than any wet year ever had. Then she sat on the ridge, with the dry village below her, and gave him the first law of fire in a thatched street. It was the law her father had given her. "Fire crosses a street on thatch, your grace. Flame does not need to touch. Sparks ride the wind from roof to roof, and a coat of straw that sheds rain 40 years will drink a live spark whole. One live ember can take a dry coat before a man has crossed the yard. There is one answer to a burning street, and it is a hard one. You take the roofs off, pull the thatch down ahead of the fire, soak the timbers beneath it, and drag the coat clear. Then the fire loses its easiest road, and men can beat out what still catches. You were describing tearing down a man's roof to save his neighbors. I am describing the only doctrine that has ever stopped a thatch fire," she said. "Ask any parish that learned it too late." When the patch was tight, she came down. He was still there, in his shirt sleeves, chaffed to the elbows and absurdly pleased with himself. Something had shifted between them. He had stopped speaking to her as the letter's subject and begun speaking to her as the roof's master. "You keep no man to help you?" he asked. "A master has a mate, surely, a boy at least, to hold the ladder and serve the straw." "Masters keep boys, your grace. The vestry pays me a boy's wage. It cannot then pay a boy's wage under the boy's wage, or the fiction grows too rich even for Shalbourne." It was said dry and level, without self-pity. "My ladder is not held by dukes. It is held by the boy." "Then I am the boy," said the Duke of Stowholt. He rode away with his coat over his arm. The notice stood, the quarter-day stood, but at the bend of the lane he looked back at the almshouse roof, and the question rode home with him and would not dismount. What was a man to do with the one thing on his land that had come to him with no testimonial at all, and was better than everything that had? Mr. Bulstrode came up to the hall on the Friday, as every Friday, with the estate's business docketed under his arm. He found his employer in an unfamiliar humour. "The almshouse roofs," said the Duke. "I am told the spring repairs have failed." "Told, your grace?" Bulstrode set his papers down in good order. "By whom, may I ask?" "Ah, the thatcher woman." He said the word with a fine regret, a man obliged to name an awkwardness. I would expect nothing else, Your Grace. The firm's work carries a written warranty and named sureties. Hers carries an opinion. At Michaelmas the question retires itself, and I shall be glad of it. A dead man's name on parish books does an estate no credit. It invites talk. The woman took me into the loft. I saw daylight through the firm's patching. I saw it, Bulstrode. Your Grace saw points of light in a dark roof, and heard them explained by the person with the most to gain from the explanation. Bulstrode's voice was all kindness. This is precisely why gentlemen keep warranted men, so that they need not stand in lofts being persuaded. If the firm's work is faulty, the firm can be compelled to make it good, and that is worth more than any patch. Now, the quarter-day accounts. The kiln is answering well. The new granary range will be roofed by Michaelmas, and the corn trade stands thus. And the business rolled on, smooth and unhurried, and the almshouse recoat was refused as economy. 11 weeks to Michaelmas. Harvey signed what was put before him, disliked himself for signing, and did not entirely know why. The eldest of the Shalbourne almshouses belonged by custom to Mrs. Twelvetrees. She had been 40 years cook at Stowholt Hall, and was 70 now, tall and upright, her iron and flax hair braided high. Her kitchen was where the parish's memory was kept. Dulcie sat in it that evening with a mug of small beer, as she had since she was a child. It was Mrs. Twelvetrees who raised what the parish never raised. He came up my ladder himself, I hear, the young Duke, carried straw like a Christian. The old woman's eyes were quick and pale. Mind yourself, child. The father was a good man and a weak one, and the weakness let the agent in, and the agent has been the estate this 15 year. The son is not weak, but he was schooled by weak men, and he trusts paper. Paper is what ruined your father when all's said. A fire ruined my father, Mrs. Twelvetrees. A verdict ruined your father. The fire only gave them the occasion. She set down her knitting and told it, for telling it was her way of keeping it. September of the year 6, 3 weeks before the Michaelmas measure, when all the estate's corn should have been counted through the barn doors. The great barn took fire in the night. The threshed reserve of the home farms stood in its granary bay at the north end, and that was what the county said went up. No lives. God was merciful there. But one man's name. Your father was midway through recoating that roof. His ladders stood at the eaves, and by morning the county wanted a careless man with a pipe, and there were his ladders to point at. He was dismissed unheard. The agent's letters had already decided it. Zachary Maidment, that had sat at my table 40 year, and he was dead inside 4 winters, and he never once told me what he was carrying, and I have wondered since whether that was to spare me or to spare himself. I remember the winter after, Dulcie said. The estate would not have him, nor any farm the estate could frown at, and then the widow Harding's roof failed in the February rains, and there was no other thatcher inside 20 miles, and she came to our door after dark with her shawl over her head, so nobody would see her asking. He went up the next morning. He never once spoke of it as a shame done to him, becoming after dark. He said a roof has no opinion of its owner, and when his hands began to fail, he stood at the ladder foot and talked me up the roof course by course, and that is where I was made, Mrs. Twelvetrees. On other people's roofs, after dark, at a boy's wage, so I know what the work is worth without the name on it. To the very farthing I know. The kitchen fire ticked. Then the old woman said what the parish had kept to its own tables for 12 years. I'll tell you what farmers' wives said that autumn. In this kitchen with the door shut, a full granary bay smoulders, child. Corn packed close in the sack won't flame away like loose straw. A barn with a reserve in it burns slow and stinking for a fortnight. The great barn was cold ash in a day and a night. Cold, child. I fed the fire watchers that night with my own hands, and by the second evening there was nothing left to watch. Every farmer at that fire said quietly to his wife that the bay burned wrong, and we let your father carry the name out of the parish on his back." "Why nowhere else?" Dulcie asked. It came out very quiet. "Because my sister's boy said a quarter of it aloud, in the malt house, in the year 7. He lost his place by Lady Day, and no reason ever given. The parish can count, child. We learned the price of talking, and we paid our silence instead, and silence has kept its own count of us ever since." Old Woolgar had been the estate carpenter 30 years and more, until Mr. Bulstrode's great reorganization put him aside in the year 7. He was 70-odd now, long as a rope, white-bearded, with hill shepherd bones, and he kept a bench in the village and mended what came. Dulcie brought him her spar hooks to set new handles and stayed, as everyone stayed at Woolgar's, for the talk. "Estate iron," he said, turning a hook to the light and finding the mark on the tang. "There's the Wheat-Sheaf, see? See, I swung that stamp myself 30 year. Every tool, every hasp, every lock, every sack the estate owns, struck against pilfering. A man walking off with a stamped sack has no story to tell. You read the mark at a glance, same as a horseshoe brand, and it ends the argument. You hung the great barn's doors, my father always said. Hung the doors, cut the wicket, fitted the hasp. The old man's chisel kept its slow pace. The wicket, that's the small door cut inside the great doors that men use daily so the great leaves need not be swung. Barred the great doors from within nightly, locked the wicket with an estate padlock. Wheat-Sheaf on the crown. Every yard lock its own key, girl. No two the same, and every one of those keys on one iron ring. And the ring, from the year 3 onwards, hung on the agent's own watch chain, day and night, and was rendered to no man. Mr. Bulstrode would have order in the yard, and order meant one ring, and the ring meant him. Custom of the yard, girl. Any man who worked it will tell you the same. He said it as yard talk, an old man telling over the furniture of a working life. Dulcie carried it home the same way, one more plain fact in a parish full of them. It sat in her, quiet, next to a padlock at the bottom of a tool basket, and neither spoke to the other. Not yet. Work is a truth that keeps. You can write the wrong name over it for 12 years, and the day it is needed, it answers to the right one. The echo came the next week at her own ladder foot, and it was Bulstrode who sounded it. The Duke had ridden over to see the almshouse roof finished, which was not, strictly, a reason. His agent had ridden with him, which was not an accident. Dulcie was aloft, dressing the new work over the door range, and Bulstrode pitched his voice at the Duke and let the roof overhear. "I ought to say, Your Grace, since you have taken an interest, that my concern was never the quality of the woman's work. It is the association, the name." A pause, beautifully weighted, full of reluctance. "Your Grace will not know the history. The father was the Thatcher Maidment that burned the great barn in the year 6, through a pipe in the loft and the carelessness of his trade. The county does not forget these things. They say fire runs in families, Your Grace, and the parish pays the burner's daughter to lay tinder on every roof in Shalbourne. That is the arrangement I am ending at Michaelmas, and I had rather end it kindly than see it end some harder way." The legate did not stop. "Knock! Knock!" Dulcie Maidment did not answer and did not look down, and her silence was not meekness. It was a woman declining to hand her father's name to a man for playing with. She laid the course true, and the sun stood on the new straw. The Duke noticed that she did not come down. He noticed the shape of what his agent had just done, and could not name a single sentence in it that was not courteous. He rode home in the heat with his agent talking pleasantly of lime and corn prices, and he noticed that he himself had said nothing at all, and that the saying of nothing had cost him nothing, and that it should have. After that the Duke kept coming back, and the parish began to watch. He came at wrong hours, which is to say at working hours, when a gentleman calls on nobody. He did not call, exactly. He would ride into whatever yard her ladders stood in, dismount, take off his hat, and wait at the ladder foot to be noticed. The Duke of Stowholt stood bareheaded in the chaff like a boy outside a master's shop. The first time, she let him stand a full quarter hour to see whether he would tire of it. He did not. He watched the work. "If your grace means to stand there," she said at last, "you know the law of this yard. Nobody stands idle at my ladder foot. You hold, you carry, or you go." "I'll carry," said the Duke, and hung his coat on the rung. So the strangest apprenticeship in Wiltshire ran through the white heart of that drought. He learned to draw a yelm and square its butts, and to point spars. He learned why she walked a roof at dawn with her palm flat on the straw, reading the coat's tightness through her hand. He learned what a ligger was, the split rod that rides the outside of a ridge and holds its skirts down against the wind. His hands blistered and hardened, and he was too proud to hide the blisters and too honest to display them. And a boy driving cows past the church saw the Duke miss his grip on a yelm and catch it, and heard the thatcher say, "Steady, boy," and heard the Duke of Stowholt answer, "Aye, master." And by nightfall the parish owned the joke and loved them both for it. Once they rested in the shade at noon with the water jug between them. He asked her the question a duke can afford and a parish cannot. "Why do you stay? There are towns would give a craftsman like you a full wage and no fictions, and nobody there would care whose daughter you were." "That is why," she said. "Nobody there would care whose daughter I am. Here, one day, somebody must." She passed the jug. "And there is a plainer reason. 40 roofs in this parish, and I know every one as well as you know the faces at your own table. Which ridge went on green and wants watching? Which chimney draws sparks in a north wind? Which eave the starlings get into? A stranger with a testimonial knows none of it. A roof is not thatched in a week. It is thatched over 20 years by somebody who stays. And when Michaelmas comes, she said, getting up and settling her kerchief, the knowing goes wherever I go. Come up, boy. The light is too good to sit in." Dulcie named the arithmetic to herself, once, aloft, where she did her honest thinking. To be seen at last, and by the one man in England whose seeing she could not afford. The sum did not come out, and she laid straw on it. Bulstrode did not leave the field to sentiment. In the last week of July he brought the county firm's surveyor to Shalbourne. He walked him from roof to roof with a printed schedule of defects, at an hour when the street was full. The surveyor was a clean, cushioned man who had never climbed a ladder in his life. He read her work off his schedule item by item, in a voice pitched for the audience. Irregular coat work, non-standard fixings, ridge ornament in the old country manner, wasteful of straw. He had a phrase he was pleased with, and used it at every third house. Parish patchwork, gentlemen. Charming, no doubt. But charm is not a specification. At the almshouses he said it once too often, in range of Mrs. Twelvetrees, shelling peas with the face of a cathedral. "Young man," she said, "that patchwork kept my bed dry through the wet spring of 16, when the tower gutters your firm relined filled my church porch like a horse trough. Charm did that. You may put it on your schedule." There was laughter, quickly swallowed. Bulstrode bowed to her with perfect courtesy and made a note in his book. Dulcie watched from a roof away and felt the small cold of it. A man who wrote your friends down did not write them down for nothing. The lime kiln stood at the end of the estate yard, 30 yards to windward of Church Row. All that rainless summer its fires never went cold. Bulstrode's new granary range must be walled and mortared by Michaelmas, and lime does not burn itself. In the first week of August the wind went round to the southwest and stayed there, bone dry. Then Dulcie asked the Duke for the first favour she had ever asked him. He was to walk with her to the kiln and stand where she stood and look where she pointed. "Watch the open kiln mouth when the fire draws hard," she said. "There, your grace saw it. Sparks riding the wind, alive past the yard wall. Now turn about and look at Church Row. 30 yards, and every roof of it thatch, and the wells at rope's end. One live ember can take a dry coat before a man has crossed the yard, your grace. A kiln is a fine servant, and it is sited here like a loaded gun laid on a table facing the village. It wants moving beyond the rise or banking cold until the wind backs or the rain comes. Knowing what a spark will take is my trade's first business, and I am telling your grace what a spark will take. The Duke carried the question to the yard that same afternoon, and Bulstrode met it at the kiln itself. He answered his employer with the wind lifting a thin veil of ash past his shoulder. Your grace, the yard is ordered by warranted men. The kiln was sited by the firm's own surveyor and burns under the eye of men who answer for it at law. Straw fears nothing that minds its business. He smiled gently at the woman standing behind her Duke. I comprehend the anxiety. Fire is a family subject, but an estate cannot bank its works cold every time the wind blows from an inconvenient quarter. Economy, your grace, is only another word for keeping one's promises to the future. The Duke stood between his agent's warranties and his thatcher's certainty, and chose the paper. The kiln burned on. Dulcie walked home past Church Row, looking up at eaves she had laid or mended with her own hands. She said nothing further. A warning twice given and twice refused becomes a quarrel, and she could not afford the quarrel. She moved her own water butts instead, quietly, to the windward end of the row, and she told the almshouse women to keep their kindling clear of the walls. That evening the Duke did not ride home directly. He came to the ladder foot at the almshouses, hat off as always, where she was taking down her tackle in the long gold light. For once he did not offer to carry anything. What came out of him came slowly, and cost him something at every sentence. I want you to understand what I am, he said. I was reared for this title in a particular school. My father was an invalid 12 years. The estate was governed from his sick room by letter, and the letters were drafted by the man you saw today. I was taught that a gentleman's whole art is choosing whose word to take. I can read a testimonial as thoroughly as you read a roof, Miss Maidment. Every seal, every hedge, every soft place in the wording. I stood at that kiln today and understood that it is the only skill I have. I was never taught to weigh work, only paper about work, and when the two are set against each other, my hand goes to the paper like a horse to its own stable door, and I hate the motion even as I make it. Dulcie coiled her line and looked at him, this big, gold, troubled man who had carried her straw for a month. Then she gave him the truth, flattery being no tool of hers. Then your grace had better decide which failing is dearer, she said. The paper will always be there to go back to. The work is only there while it stands. Roofs, harvests, villages, me. And paper never yet held a roof on against the wind. He looked at her a moment longer than the sentence required, put his hat on, and rode away. The notice still stood. Michaelmas was 8 weeks off, but something in the man had shifted its footing, and both had felt it move, and neither had a word they could afford to give it. In mid-August, the church ridge wanted attention, for the ridge roll had worked loose in the heat. That is the thick bolster of straw that caps the two slopes and turns the weather off the joint, and a ridge left loose in August is a roof lost in October. It was 2 days' work for two, high and hot and exacting. There was no question who the second pair of hands would be. They worked through the white middle of the day because the straw handled best dry. The two of them were alone on the ridge of Shalbourne Church, with the village small and far below, the downs swimming in heat to every horizon, and the swifts cutting the air about the tower. He had got good, and she gave it to him the only place she gave anybody anything, in the work. She let him lay the last length of ridge roll himself. She stood his holding rod while he fixed it, and watched his big hands do a thing gently and get it right. There, she said, no paper in England can do that. No, he said, Nothing I was ever taught could do that. They rested at the day's turn with their backs against the tower parapet. Up there the truth came easier, and he told her that his London acquaintance would not know him, brown as a carter and his hands like a carter's, and that he did not mourn the loss. And she told him about the first roof she ever laid a course on, 9 years old, her father's hand over hers on the legget. She told him how she had cried the day she understood that the craft in her hands would be entered in the book under a name that could never be hers. It was the most either had ever said to the other that was not the work, and the afternoon went on gold and slow above the small brown village. He reached for the next yilm as she reached to give it, and her hands and his met on the straw and stopped there, longer than any handing requires. The village lay below them, the heat lay round them, neither moved, and the moment stood wide open, and it was Dulcie who shut it. She drew her hand back, squared the yilm herself, and set her eyes on the work, because she had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic did not care what her hands wanted. She was a tenant under notice, in this man's gift, 6 weeks from losing her cottage, her wage and her ladder room in his parish. She would still be all of that when they came down, and he would still be the man whose signature could end it. The sum was hers to keep, and she kept it. "Serve the straw, boy," she said, and her voice was level and only just. "Aye, master," said the Duke of Stowholt quietly, and served the straw, and the ridge went on true, and what had opened on that roof did not close. It waited, and they went on working. Bulstrode chose the vestry of the 22nd of August, with the Duke present, to lay the fiction open on the table. He did it as he did everything, in the language of regret and good order. The county firm's testimonials lay fanned before him, and the vestry book stood open at the accounts. "Gentlemen, I have served this estate 15 years, and there is a duty I have put off too long out of tenderness for the parish's feelings. The vestry accounts of this parish have carried, for 8 years, payments to Maidment, Thatcher. Gentlemen, Zachary Maidment died in January of the year 10. The date stands in the burial register. The work has been done, as every soul in this room has always known, by a woman. I do not say the work was ill done. I say the record is false, and has been false 8 years, and every man who signed these accounts signed a falsehood, and it ends today. A parish cannot be dry in its roofs and rotten in its book." Silence. Then it was broken from the far end of the table. It was the honest farmer who had been looked at until he shut his mouth at the first of these meetings, and who had never made a speech in his life. "Then write, Dulcie Maidment," he said. Mr. Bulstrode did not quarrel with it. He agreed with it and buried it under good order. "Nothing would give me greater satisfaction, but the county contract stands provisionally approved, and there is no tender before us in that name. No testimonials, no sureties, no warranty under her own hand, the work having come to her by custom and never by appointment. And consider what you would be telling an auditor. That 8 years of payment to a dead man is made good by voting the same arrangement afresh in the hour you confess it. That is writing the falsehood a second time in a better hand. New appointments wait upon formal notice and a properly summoned vestry, as they always have. It was procedure spoken with the confidence of law, and Bulstrode was the only man in the room who knew enough procedure to challenge it. The farmer sat back, and nobody asked when the ordinary season fell. And the Duke looked at the fan of testimonials, and at the open book, and at every rule he had ever been raised on standing in a row behind his agent. All of it was in perfect order, and the word he wanted was not there. He sat in the vestry of Shalbourne church with his floor across his knees. The silence ran on past mending, and he said the half of it that cost him nothing. "The record must be set in order," he said at last, and his own voice sounded borrowed to him. "That is not a thing I can gainsay." He said the false account must end. He did not say her true appointment began. The estate's thatching was in his own gift. One sentence would have carried it, and the sentence was never spoken. It was done in 10 minutes, and the Maidment name was struck from the parish work. The work and the tied cottage were confirmed to the county firm from Michaelmas, and the clerk's pen scratched. Bulstrode gathered his papers with the sober face of a man who has performed a sad duty, and said one thing more at the door. The parish will want to give notice to its present arrangement. I will carry the word myself. It is kinder from a principal than a clerk. He carried it that evening to the almshouse yard, where she was loading her ladders. The Duke rode at his side, wretched, and let him. Miss Maidment, the vestry has set its record in order. Your engagement with the parish ends at Michaelmas, as the estates did before it. You'll want a warranted man at your own ladder henceforward, your grace. He smiled, and it was the first thing he had done all day that was not beautiful. The boy is released. So he knew. The parish's darling joke had reached the one hearer with a use for it. In his mouth it came out a small dead thing, and the yard was quiet. Dulcie looked at neither of them. She finished roping the ladders. The Duke waited until the agent had ridden out of the yard, and then came to her, hat in his hands, and began, "Miss Maidment, the record, you must understand there was nothing in law I could." And she turned and gave him one sentence, level and low, and it stopped him where he stood. The account was false. You let him make that mean the work was false. She took up the barrow shafts and walked her ladders home down Church Row, past the eaves she had kept, everyone. The Duke stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and let her go, because everything true he could have called after her was a thing he had sat silent in a vestry and signed away that afternoon. The drought had one more week in it, and the week was the worst. The last of the shallow wells went to mud. The pond by the smithy cracked to a white saucer, and Shalbourne drew from the 2 deep ones at rope's end. Grass gave out on the downs, and the beasts came down to the closes. Men mowed nettles in the shade lanes for them and looked at the sky every hour, and the sky gave nothing back. And the kiln burned. Day and night now for Michaelmas was 5 weeks off, and the granary range must be roofed. Under a gust, the fire hole sent live cinders lifting past the arch and over the yard wall, and the wind gusted from the southwest, dry, day upon day. Dulcie caught herself walking Church Row at dusk, with her palm itching, reading eaves she no longer had any right to mend. Mrs. Twelvetrees moved the almshouse kindling stack from the house wall to the far side of the garden with her own arms. 2 mornings before it mattered. One of the other women asked her why, and she looked at the ribbon of smoke standing over the estate yard and said, "Because I cook by fire, my dear, and I have known fire longer than that man has known accounts." Budden came to her door 2 nights later, after dark, hat in both hands, shaking. "He's been at me again," the carter said, before she had the door full open. "Mr. Bulstrode, he wants night carriage out of the granary before the measure, same as before." The old man's voice went from under him, and he steadied it with what he had. "I told him my carting days were done. He reminded me whose land my cottage stands on, and named the quarter day, and smiled at me. 12 years I've kept clear of him, and he walks into my garden, and it is the year 6 again. And I can't carry it no more, girl. Not with a duke in the county that might listen. Come with me now and bring the light." They walked the chalk lane in the dark to the hovel she had thatched all her working life. Budden took a key from round his neck. Where it had lived so long the string had worn a groove in him. He unlocked the estate padlock on the door she had never seen open, and stood aside. Sacks. 1 wagon's whole load of them, 15 sacks ranked close on a boarded floor. The floor stood clear of the earth on mushroom-shaped staddle stones. Every sack struck with the Stowholt Wheat-Sheaf, plain to read in the lamplight. 12 years dry, and 12 years dead. The corn in them had gone to dust and weevil long ago, and had not been bred since. It was not kept to eat. It was kept because it could not be got rid of, and it was kept under a roof that never once let a drop through. "The 6th load," Budden said from the doorway, not coming in. "Now you'll hear it all, and God forgive me the waiting. In the 3 weeks before the great barn burned, I carried 5 loads of sacked corn out of that barn's granary bay by night, on the agent's quiet order, out the back lane towards the down-country dealers, and I asked no questions. 5 loads, girl. The 6th stands before you." And loading me for the 6th, he said, "When the 6th is out, the barn takes care of itself." And I was to be well down the lane before I looked behind. I was on the road with it when the fire cry went up behind me, and I stood on the lane with the sky going red over Shalbourne, and understood what I was part of. So I turned the wagon round. I couldn't return the load without hanging myself, nor sell that stamp without hanging myself twice. I had sent word already that the last cart was delivered, and nobody ever came looking. So I built it a tomb, and paid your father to keep the roof of it sound, and he never asked me why, bless the man. And I have lived over it 12 years like a sexton, and watched them lay the fire on him, and said nothing. There is my shame, whole, and you may do with it what you like." Dulcie stood in the small dark among the stamped sacks, and 12 years rearranged themselves around her in silence. Her father had known, not all of it perhaps, but the shape, because Budden asks and won't say why, and then the last piece came home to her hearth. She walked back down the lane half running, knelt at the long tool basket inside her own door, and dug beneath the iron and lifted out the padlock. "The lock that fits nothing," she said aloud, to nobody at all. Open, unforced. Shackles swung wide, kept 12 years under the shears. She heard old Woolgar's bench talk again with new ears. Every yard lock its own key, and every key on one ring, and the ring on the agent's chain, from the year 3. Her father had been first up his own ladders at the alarm, and first down through the smoke. He had taken this off the wicket's hasp with the great doors still barred behind it. Then he was dismissed, before any man was made to look at what he held. He had not been keeping shame in the bottom of his basket. He had been keeping the door's own testimony for a listener who never came. And kneeling there, she understood why he had never carried it further. An open lock proves a barn was entered by a key, and nothing about whose hand turned it. Her father wrote once himself, the winter of the year 7, and the letter came back with the seal unbroken. To accuse the agent would have cost them the last work in the county that fed them. She sat back on her heels on her own floor and put it together, one movement at a time, in the order a roof is called. It stood up, every course of it, and she was a struck-off woman, 5 weeks from losing her roof, with a carter afraid of his own shadow and a lock nobody living was obliged to look at. The one man with power to hear it was the man whose paper had already voted. For the first time in 12 years she had the truth entire, and no door to carry it through. "Keep the parish dry," she said, to the empty room. "Whoever gets the wage." She was still sitting there when the wind rose. The fire came at dusk 2 days later, the last Friday of August, and it came exactly as she had said it would. The wind had risen all afternoon, hot gusts out of the southwest with dust in them. The kiln that Mr. Bulstrode would not bank drew harder at its open mouth as the wind drew it. In one gust of that evening, sparks rode over the yard wall and crossed the 30 yards to the eve-end thatch of the first cottage in Church Row. The straw drank them. For the space of a Lord's Prayer there was only a rom-coloured light under the eave. Then the coat took, and the first roof of Church Row was alight from eave to ridge. The burning spread back along the ridgeline even against the wind, because dry thatch will carry flame any road once the coat has taken. There was no bell rung, and no horn blown. The alarm went as it had gone in Shalbourne for 500 years, mouth to mouth up the street. "Fire! Fire in the row!" Fists beat on doors, and men spilled out half-dressed. The wind gusted. It lifted a sheet of sparks off the burning roof and laid them on the next roof down the row, and the next coat drank and took. 2 roofs, and Church Row ran downhill, and it ran the way a fire would want it. The kiln stood at the upper end, in the estate yard behind its wall. Below the wall, the 14 cottages went down the slope in one line of thatch. The smithy stood square among them, 5 doors down, dividing the row. Below the smithy came the church house, then the narrow gap of the churchyard, then the almshouses where the old slept. Every roof of it straw, and the wells at rope's end. The first fist on her door was the parish's answer to a question nobody had time to feel the shame of. She was dressed and shod already, having sat up with a padlock in her lap listening to that wind. She came out with her ladders on her shoulder. A young churchwarden stood wild in her gateway, the light of the row behind him. "Miss Maidment, Dulcie, for God's love come. Nobody knows what to do." "I know what to do," she said. And then, because she was her father's daughter and had waited 12 years to say it, she said one thing more, level, already walking. "You'll want a warranted man tonight." "We want you," said the churchwarden, and took the ladders off her shoulder and carried them himself running. She came up Church Row into the light and the heat, and she did not run, because a master does not run on a working roof or under one. The street was milling and shouting. It saw her come, and went quiet around her in rings, because the parish had always known, under every fiction in its book, whose hands these were. She read the fire's road first, standing in the street with the glow on her face. 2 roofs alight, the wind quartering up the row, sparks going downwind in sheets on every gust. Then she began to call it, one order at a time, loud and slow enough to be heard once and obeyed. The beasts first, every cow, pig and horse out of the yards and up the drove to the sheep walk now, and boys with them, and the boys stay with them. That was done before the 3rd roof took, and the beasts went over the hill and out of the night. Water next. The row's own butts are for the sheets, not for throwing. Bucket chain from the deep well at the smithy, every soul over 12 and under 60 in 2 lines, full buckets up one side, empties down the other. With the wells this low, do not spend the water chasing the heart of a thatch fire. Wet the roofs ahead of it, and the men working them. Wet sheets on the church side, every blanket, every sheet, every sack in the street, soaked and laid on the church house thatch, and the almshouse eaves, long ladders to lay them, old men to mind them, wet and wet again as they dry. And the hooks. Fetch the parish fire hooks up from the church house, both of them, and every ladder in Shalbourne to me. You. She had a boy by the shoulder before he knew he had been chosen. Take the sound horse to Stowholt Hall, bring every able hand, and tell his grace the kiln has fired Church Row. Say it in those words. And to the churchwarden at her elbow, send for Mr. Bulstrode and for the granary keys, and get the yard's fire gear down here. Hooks, ladders, buckets, the lot. It is ours tonight. The parish fire hooks were great iron crooks on ash poles, 3 men long, kept by the churchwardens for exactly this night. It was Woolgar who came up the street with the first of them, and behind him came every ladder in the village on men's shoulders. She put him over the laddermen with one sentence. The old foreman set and footed and shifted them to her calling, 30 years dropping off him at the work. Then she told the street what the night was, because men work better told. Hear me, all of you. Fire crosses a street on thatch, and it crosses fastest through deep, dry thatch. Strip the coat ahead of it. Soak the timbers underneath, and make the fire fight for every yard. We cannot put this fire out. There is not water enough in the parish, so we take away its road. We pull the roofs ahead of the burning. When the flames reach wet, stripped timbers, they have lost the deep, dry coat that carries them. Then we beat down what catches. It is a hard doctrine, and it is the only one. The row is gone from the smithy up. from the smithy down we make our stand." The boy was at Stowholt Hall inside the half-hour. Her own order came back up Church Row in the shape of the Duke of Stowholt at the gallop, with half the hall behind him, footmen, grooms, gardeners, every man with a bucket or a bar. He reined up in front of a street already moving to a single voice, and the voice was hers. He sat his horse for 3 breaths and watched, the bucket chains swinging in their 2 lines, the wet sheets going up the church house slope, the hook crews waiting marked and ready on her word, and the woman in the Delft blue gown in the ember light in the middle of it all, calling the parish as a master calls a roof. Every paper he owned had voted against her, twice, and here stood the work itself, at the 1 hour of his life when the difference was mortal, and the Duke of Stowholt looked at the work and, in front of his own household and all of Shalbourne, unsigned. "Miss Maidment commands here," he said, in the voice the title kept for the county bench. "The estate answers to her tonight. Every man of mine, hers. Whatever she orders done on estate property, I order it." He came to her through the smoke with his coat already off, and for one heartbeat, in the middle of the burning street, something in her face let him all the way in. "Well, Your Grace," she said, "you hold, you carry, or you go." "Give me the rope's work," said the Duke. "I've a back for it." Bulstrode arrived on her next order. The next order was the granary. She had seen the shape of it a quarter hour before anyone else, because seeing it was her trade. The row's burning end would spend itself on the pulled gap at the smithy, but the wind was quartering, and on the yard side the fire had one more road. That road was Bulstrode's own new thatched granary range, running down towards the church house and the almshouses beyond. Sparks were already catching in its windward eave, and being beaten out with wet sacks, and each gust brought more. "The granary roof comes off," she said, "now while the coat's still cold. It is the bridge between the fire and the church, and I'll not fight flames on the almshouse eaves when I can starve them here. Woolgar, ladders to the windward end, hook crews to me." And Stanley Bulstrode put himself in front of the doors. He did not shout. He stood in the ember light in his blue-black superfine watch chain across his front. He spoke with the even calm of a man producing his best weapon. "The man who lays a hook on estate property answers for it at the assizes, Your Grace. Wilful destruction of a granary and the corn it holds. And so will the woman who commands it, and every man who hauls on her rope. I shall have every name." His pale eyes went along the hook crews, and men who had faced the fire looked away from him. "There is corn in this building. The Michaelmas return stands sworn full. Burn Shalbourne's cottages if you are careless enough, gentlemen, but the estate's harvest is not this woman's to spend." "There is no leave to ask, Mr. Bulstrode," Dulcie said. "The fire will have this roof off inside the hour, or I will have it off now. The difference is what stands under the rafters at morning. The church, the almshouses, choose." Bulstrode did not move, and every eye in the yard went where it had gone all night. The Duke of Stowholt walked forward and stood between his agent and the doors, and his voice shook and held and carried. "Stand away from the doors, Mr. Bulstrode. The return is sworn, the corn stands in my name, and the loss is mine to take. If the assizes want a name for this night's work, they may have mine. Miss Maidment, take the roof." "You pull a roof from the windward eave," she had told him once, on an afternoon that belonged to another life, "and it comes off in one fleece." Now the parish watched the doctrine made flesh. Ladders went up at the windward gable, and she went up alone with the first line. She walked the ridge with the burning row lighting the work, and set the great hooks deep in the coat, 1, 2, 3 down the slope's length. She paid the lines down into the hands of the hook crews. Then she counted them from the ridge end, crew by crew, until she had seen every man's hands on a rope. Then she came down, because that was her own law, and she was not breaking it on the one night it could kill somebody. Nobody stays on a roof that is coming off, and nobody stands where it will land. She came down the leeward gable ladder and took it off the wall behind her. Then she walked the cruise back beyond the fall of the slope, until the ground under that roof held nothing but rope. Then she went up 3 steps of the stone gable stair, where the yard could see her, and she could see the whole roof. She looked down the principal line to the pair of hands at the head of it. "Take the rope, boy." "Aye, master," said the Duke of Stowholt, and the parish, filthy, scorched and bailing, heard the joke stand up in the firelight and laughed aloud, 30 voices in the burning night, and hauled the gladder for it. She stood on the stair in deep Delft blue, kerchief bright, one arm raised, the fire's glow one side of the sky, and the first cold coming of dawn on the other. The roof above her had 3 hooks in it, and not one soul upon it. She called the pull, the only order the night had left. Together, haul! The whole windward slope came off in one fleece. It let go with a sound of 1,000 spars drawing at once, a long tearing sigh. It slid, and fell into ground where nobody stood. The yard vanished in a golden storm of straw and chaff and dust, with men whooping inside it. When the air cleared, the granary stood open to the sky from ridge to eave, bare rafters against the first light of morning. "Not done yet," she called. "Bare wood is no firebreak till it's wet and clear." The bucket chain came round off the church house and soaked the naked timbers end to end. Wet sacks went over what boarding was left, and the fallen coat was dragged away downwind and beaten out in the open. And the fire took the stripped range twice. Once it took in a shred of coat under the gable, a yard of flame along streaming oak, beaten out with sacking. Once it took in the dragged heap by the wall, tall enough to light every face in the yard. Twice it was beaten down. After that it had nowhere left, no road onto the church house, none onto the almshouses, nothing above the wet timbers but morning. The fire came to the edge of the gap, and hung, and shrank, and died where it stood. The street was saved behind them. 5 cottages gone, the 5 above the smithy, burned or pulled, 9 standing, and the church house, and the almshouses with their eaves never once taken. 14 households stood filthy in the dawn and counted each other whole, and Mrs. Twelvetrees was handing bread and beer down the spent bucket lines. And then the light came up the rest of the way, and the yard went quiet, 1 man at a time. Because the granary stood open to the sky from end to end, and the parish, hooks still in hand, was looking into it. Looking at bays the Michaelmas return had sworn full, standing in the pitiless morning light above half empty, and at the near end, on the boarded floor by the great doors, stood estate-stamped sacks by the score. They were sheeted and ranked, ready for carriage that was to have been done by night. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then old Woolgar, leaning on his fire hook, said it for the 100 of them, in the voice of a man reading a mark. "There's a barn been emptied before it's burning," he said. "Now where have I heard that tale before?" Full morning found Church Row steaming, the burnt end black and dripping, and not one roof lost beyond the pulled gap. The parish stood about in the strange, loud gentleness of people who have worked all night and won. That was the hour Bulstrode chose to come back, composed, brushed, the constable word ready in his mouth. "Your Grace, gentlemen." He bowed to the wrecked morning as to a meeting. "A hard night, and questions must follow it. I will say what it is my duty to say. The fire began in Church Row, among roofs of the woman's own keeping. The county has seen this history before. The father burned the great barn, and the daughter, the very week her engagement was justly ended, has burned the street that put her aside, and I require her taken in charge until the magistrates can sit. He had misjudged his mourning. He was a man of rooms, and had walked out of them into a street that had spent the night under her orders, and was still holding the hooks. Nobody moved. 100 smoke-blackened faces looked back at him, and behind him the granary stood open to the sky, the morning sun along its half-empty bays, saying everything for him. "The kiln fired the row," said a voice from the bucket line, flat. "Sparks on the wind, same as she told you to your face a month gone." "The kiln," said Bulstrode, "is warranted. On any other morning of the last 15 years that sentence would have ended the matter." He watched it land on nothing, and a first fine crack came into his voice. "I require the woman taken in charge." Everything said in that yard next had been true for 12 years, and had lain in Shalbourne all that time in 4 separate keepings. The night brought all 4 into one street. It was Mrs. Twelvetrees who spoke first. She came forward through the crowd to the granary steps with her sleeves still wet from the bread and beer, 70 years old and bolt upright. She spoke steady and loud, the fear of 12 years gone somewhere in the smoke of the night. "Before anyone is taken anywhere, Mr. Bulstrode, I will say what I have kept 12 years, and shame on me for the keeping. Zachary Maidment never smoked a pipe. 40 years in and out of my kitchen at the Hall, and the verdict that ruined him was built on a pipe that never was. And I stood in that yard at the first alarm. The great doors were barred fast from within, but the wicket, the small door cut inside them, stood open, and its padlock hung open on the hasp, whole and unforced. I saw it with these eyes, and said it to nobody." The yard was silent. Dulcie came up the steps beside her, and took from under her arm the thing she had carried all night. She laid it on the top step in the sun, stamp up, where 100 people could read the Wheat-Sheaf on the crown. A heavy estate padlock, open shackle swung wide. "My father took this off that hasp with his own hands," she said, "first down through the smoke, and he was dismissed before any man could be made to look at it, and it has lain at the bottom of his tool basket 12 years. The great barn was emptied before it ever burned, and then it was opened with a key. That door was never forced. I made every lock on that ring," said Woolgar from the foot of the steps, firehook still in his fist. "Each lock its own key, all the keys on one ring, and the ring on Mr. Bulstrode's watch chain from the year 3 to this morning. And Zachary sat at my bench that night till the cry went up. I have said it at my own table 12 years. I say it in the street now." And then Budden came forward, hat in his 2 hands, shaking, and said his shame in the morning light. "I carried the 5 loads out of the granary bay. Night carriage, the agent's quiet order, no questions, the year 6. He said when the 6th was out, the barn took care of itself. The 6th is standing in my hovel yet. Who believes a carter against an agent? That is my whole excuse, neighbours, and it is not enough, and there it is." "It was enough for 12 years of fear," said Dulcie. "I'll not see any man made to say his shame twice. You spoke, Budden. That is all I ever needed of you, and my father would say the same." And into the quiet that followed, she turned at last to face Bulstrode. "And if any soul here wants to know how a man empties a barn and means the county never to count it, that soul stood in this yard last night and watched Mr. Bulstrode set his own body in front of these doors. You watched him hide an emptied barn once, neighbours, with your own eyes, 10 hours ago. 12 years ago he hid one with fire, and my father carried the blame to his grave. 100 people did the arithmetic at once, and the silence was the sound of a verdict." Bulstrode looked from face to face for the deference that had furnished every room of his life, and found none, anywhere. His hand went of itself to the watch chain at his front. The small motion was read by every eye in the yard, and it finished him. The Duke of Stowholt came off the bottom step and stood in front of his agent. "Give up the ring, Mr. Bulstrode." The hand that had betrayed him once already unhooked the iron ring from the watch chain and laid it in the Duke's palm, because 100 people were watching. The Duke carried it up the steps to Woolgar. "You cut that wicket. Find it." The old carpenter went through the ring key by key with his thumb, in no hurry, and the yard made no sound. 19 keys on it, the keys of dead locks never taken off, because keys never are. Then he held one up in the morning sun, long-shanked, the Wheat-Sheaf struck into the bow. The wicket of the great barn that has stood a black square in the stubble since the year 6. I cut the door, and I fitted the hasp, and there was never but one of these made. Dulcie knelt to the padlock on the top step and closed the shackle, and it went home with a small, hard sound the whole yard heard. Woolgar knelt beside her and put the key in and turned it. The shackle sprang. Nobody said anything over it, and Shalbourne did not try. The Duke of Stowholt came up the granary steps and stood beside her. When he spoke, it was quiet, and all the street heard it. Before I say anything to this man, the parish will hear what I have to say about myself, because it is owed and it will not keep. Mr. Bulstrode acted through authority I gave him. The first time Dulcie Maidment warned me, I chose his paper. At the vestry I let him turn a false account into the erasure of the woman whose work was true. Those failures are mine, and nobody in Shalbourne need be delicate with me about them ever again. He turned then to the agent, and his voice did not rise. Mr. Bulstrode, 15 years you have told this estate what its papers said, and I find the papers said whatever you fed them. I am done weighing your testimonials against my own eyes. Your stewardship ends this morning. The yard and its keys pass to Woolgar, whom I am restoring to the estate service. The matter of the year 6 goes to the magistrates today, with the lock, the key, the sacks, and every soul who has spoken here this morning, and it will be for them, and not for me. He let that stand a moment, and no one breathed. The tenancies you have threatened stand safe, everyone, on my word, and my word is given in the open street. You will be off my land by Michaelmas, Mr. Bulstrode. The quarter day was your own choosing, I believe. Bulstrode did not bluster. He went with his back straight, one venomous sentence left at the foot of the steps for whoever cared to keep it. You are exchanging an agent for a thatcher, your grace. The county will laugh at you inside the 12-month. The county laughed at her for 12 years, said the Duke. I have seen what that is worth. The lane took the agent, and Shalbourne turned its back before he was out of it. What followed took the autumn and belonged to other men. The estate's books were audited out of the county town. A private cash book of Mr. Bulstrode's carried 5 sales in his own hand, each dated to one of Budden's 5 journeys, and 5 matching receipts survived in the dealer's books. The hidden 6th load, still bearing the estate's stamp, completed the order Budden had been told to carry. The key was turned in the padlock a second time, before the magistrate, and Stanley Bulstrode was committed to the Lent assizes on the theft, the false account, and the burning. 2 things were done that noon, by 2 different bodies, because the Duke had learned in one night what it costs to blur the difference. The first was his own, and took 10 minutes at a trestle on the green. It was an estate warrant, signed and sealed where anybody could watch it done. It appointed Dulcie Maidment Master Thatcher to the estate of Stowholt in her own name, at a master's wage, and it granted her the Church Row cottage for the term of her life, free of the work, so that no notice of anybody's, his own included, could take it from her again. The second was not his to give, and he did not pretend otherwise. The vestry could have waited for a room. The parish would not wait for one. They summoned themselves in the open air, with the smoke still bittering it. Every churchwarden and every voting vestryman is on this green, the clerk said, and by consent I call a special vestry, here and now. The churchwarden who had said her name in August moved it, and the green carried it without one hand against. 2 sentences went into the book on the trestle in the sun. At the Duke's asking, it was Mrs. Twelvetrees who read them aloud when the ink was dry, and her voice carried to the green's far edge. This 29th day of August, 1818. The thatching of the roofs of this parish is given to Dulcie Maidment, Master Thatcher, in her own name, and the accounts shall be entered to her and no other. And it is entered of record that Zachary Maidment, Master Thatcher of this parish, wronged by the verdict of the year 1806, kept faith with a parish that broke him, and that this book, which carried the wrong name 8 years, carries it no longer. The woman who had kept silence read the record that ended it. She closed the book. It was what a parish could do in one morning, and the Green knew it was not the whole of what was owed. The rest would wait on the assizes, and Shalbourne was willing to wait. Nobody cheered, quite. What the Green did was murmur, and press, and reach to touch Dulcie's shoulder in passing, 14 households' worth of hands. The Duke stood back deliberately, hat off, and gave the crowd's justice room to be entirely hers and her father's. Only, at the Green's edge, he stood watching her in the Delft blue with the parish about her. He said to Woolgar, half to himself, "The parish was kept dry 12 years by a name it would not write, and everything I warranted failed it in one night. Work is a truth that keeps. It waited for its right name, and the name has come to it." "Aye," said Woolgar, "that it has. Took a fire to light the reading of it, that's all." The weeks after went by in straw. There was a burnt end of Church Row to re-roof before the weather turned. The rain came back mid-September, gentle and steady and forgiven. Dulcie Maidment worked in her own name, with the parish's boys queuing to serve her yelms. She learned what it was to be paid a master's wage and greeted as a master in the street where she had been the burner's girl. The wound did not close in a week, but it had stopped being hers to carry alone. The Duke came to her ladder foot through all of it, as he always had. He came hat off, waiting to be noticed, carrying and holding when there was carrying and holding, and asking nothing. She understood what he was doing, and he knew she understood. He was letting the justice be finished before anything else was begun. No soul in the county, least of all her, would ever be able to say the one had been payment for the other. He came alone on an evening in late September. The almshouse roofs were new-coated and golden, and she was coiling the last line at the ladder foot with the low sun across the thatch. He stood his usual distance, hat in his hands, and she knew by his stillness that the waiting was over, and found her heart going hard. "Master," he said, "I've a matter to put to you. It has waited its proper season, and I'll not let it wait another." "Say it then." "Every master keeps a mate on the roof. I am asking for the post." She wound the line slow around her elbow and hand, her eyes on him steady, and the light was gold on them both. "The post is held by the boy," she said, "not for a season, master, for life." He turned the hat once in his hands, then put it down on the ladder's rung, and gave her the rest with his empty hands open, in the plain words such a thing is owed. "Dulcie Maidment, I am asking you to marry me, not the Thatcher, and not the vindicated name, though I honour both. The woman. I was taught all my life to weigh the word over the work, and you are the one soul on this earth who taught me different, and I find I cannot be schooled back. Will you have me?" "Yes," she said. No arithmetic. It had all been done long since, on a church ridge in white heat, and the sum had only wanted the county's weather to change. "Yes, I will have you, Harvey." His name, in her mouth, for the first time. He came the last 2 steps, and she let the line fall, and the kiss was long, and the low sun stood on the new thatch. And there is a boy in Shalbourne, grown old now, who swore all his life that he heard the Duke of Stowholt laughing alone in the almshouse yard that evening, laughing at nothing, hat in hand, and nobody ever much doubted him. They married at Shalbourne Church in October, small and bright, and the parish would not have sold its place in that nave for a county's ransom. Dulcie came up the aisle in Delft blue silk, the colour she had worked in all her life. The parish had only ever seen it in wool and weather, and understood at once. Same woman, richer cloth. Mrs. Twelvetrees sat magnificent in the front pew in her best shawl and wept exactly twice, at the vows and at nothing at all. Woolgar stood witness in a new coat, and wore the restoration all over him, and Budden sat at the back until the Duke walked down and fetched him forward by the arm, because honour asked it. The week before, the parish had turned out and rethatched Budden's hovel in a single day, 40 hands on one small roof. At evening, the 6th load had gone up the lane at last, 15 stamped sacks under seal. They were to be weighed before witnesses and destroyed, there having been no bread in that corn for 12 years. Budden walked bareheaded beside the wagon the whole way, and nobody made any speech about it whatever, which was the kindness done right. The vows were said clear, both of them. 2 people used to being heard the first time. And when the parson asked who gave this woman, there was a small silence, arranged beforehand and kept perfectly. Nobody stood up at all. Then Dulcie Maidment said, in her own steady voice, "I was given long ago, sir, to this parish by Zachary Maidment, Master Thatcher. He is in the book now. Let it stand as his giving." And the parson, who had helped write that sentence into the vestry book with his own hand, bowed to it and married them. Half the nave was wet-eyed and pretending otherwise. Mrs. Twelvetrees did not pretend anything, having wept her allotted twice and being done with it. They came out into thin October sun, to a street of new gold thatch at one end and the black gap at the other already staked out for rebuilding. The new married couple walked down the middle of it to a wedding breakfast at the hall, to which all the parish came. It was the first invitation the hall had issued in 15 years that no agent had drafted. Mrs. Twelvetrees sat at the Duke's own right hand, over protests that were not sincere. Midway through the meal he stood and named her before the company as the first voice of that dawn. "I shouted, Your Grace," said Mrs. Twelvetrees, rising. "It was a poor sort of speech, and I would make it again. The parish beat the tables till the crockery danced, and if the new Duchess of Stowholt slipped away from her own wedding breakfast for a quarter hour, and was found by her husband in the long gallery before a window that looked over the downs towards Church Row, nobody was told of it. What she said to him there was only this, that her father would have liked the sound the parish made tonight, and what he answered was only her own name, and the 2 of them went back into the noise together. High summer came round again. On the old blackened footings at the field edge, cleaned at last to the chalk, a new great barn stood golden and huge against a blue July sky, oak-framed, brick-plinthed and thatched, its long ridge dead straight. 2 figures were aloft finishing the ridge ornament, Dulcie and one of the 4 parish boys she had trained that year, for the master had her ways, and the estate had learnt them. The raising of it had been the estate's great work of the spring. The thatching of it was the master's own, planned through the winter at the hall's long table with straw samples on the cloth. The new agent, a plain, honest, unpolished man of Woolgar's recommending, took her orders in his book without a blink. She had chosen the straw from 3 counties and trained 4 parish boys to the trade that year. Wage and name entered honestly from their first day. The Duchess of Stowholt thatched. The county had opinions about it for a season, and the opinions starved for want of anybody in Shalbourne to feed them. At Michaelmas, the drought harvest had been measured in the open and stored among the surviving barns, every sack in the sun. The new great barn stood ready before the following harvest, under a roof with the right name on the work. A stranger on the road stopped to admire it, as strangers did. He called to the big coatless fair man at the ladder foot, who was squaring yelms with his sleeves rolled and a wedding ring on his hand. "A fine barn, friend. Who is master here?" The man at the ladder foot looked up at the figure on the ridge, dark-haired, kerchiefed, delft blue against the sky, setting the last ridge rods with the sun on her hands, and smiled the smile of a man who has ended exactly where he means to stay. "She is," he said. "I am only the boy." And that, dear friends, is the story of Dulcie Maidment, the thatcher of Shalbourne, who kept a parish dry 12 years under a dead man's name, and of Harvey, Duke of Stowholt, who learned at a ladder foot to weigh work over paper, and of the fire that undid, in one night, a lie that 12 years of verdicts had kept standing. Some truths cannot be argued into the light, friends. They must be worked into it, roof by roof and year by year, until the day comes when the work stands up in front of everybody and answers for itself, and for the one who did it, and for the name it was owed. So tell us true in the comments below. Whose work carried your town, your shop, your family, while somebody else's name was over the door? A mother, a sister, you yourself perhaps. And was it ever set right? We read every comment. If Dulcie's story warmed you, give it a like, for it truly helps us bring you more. Subscribe if you haven't yet, so you never miss a tale. Until next time, keep your roof tight and your name your own, and God keep you warm and dry.